Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Yuracek.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Professor Slawomir Nasuto, and he is a professor of cybernetics and biomedical engineering in Reading University in England. And actually he was recommended by a previous guest who I met in person, Captain Cyborg, Dr. Kevin Warwick. And it was really interesting. So basically, Dr. Nasuto talks about, cultured neurons and controlling robots, as well as EEG recordings in animals. But that's not actually what this particular episode is so much about. I guess I was in a mood, like a more of a philosophical mood, and I've been in a discussion with a friend of mine about the meaning of truth and all this kind of stuff. So I guess this is kind of what's been playing in my mind. And so we kind of got on this tangent, or this kind of I guess it's not even a tangent. It's more like a fundamental discussion of what is true, or like what is more I'm kind of trying to figure out how to describe this. Is how to approach your experiments and kind of the underlying assumptions of the experiments as well. And so we've had a really a philosophical discussion, and I found this very, very interesting. I don't think we've done this so far on the podcast. So this is more of a philosophical podcast, and more less to do with the science of it and more the philosophy of it. And so I'm trying to explain it better than this, but this is what it is. So if you're interested in this, you're going to have a great time. If you're not, if you just want to learn, the statistics of it and the designs, blah, 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 then maybe this one's not for you. But I found this to be really interesting. I'm considering very heavily to have Dr. Nasuto on again, because again, we only covered his research in a few minutes, but I found this to be very useful, and it could be very helpful, because that's the most fundamental thing, is how to approach this research. And any way you approach it, you're going to have biases, you're going to have blind spots and stuff, the things that you're looking at. So you have to be aware of what you're doing as well. So a little bit esoteric possibly, but hopefully you enjoy it, and we'll talk a little bit more on the other side.
There are different strands that effectively here in the biomedical engineering at the University of Reading, and more specifically in the brain embodiment laboratory, we are trying to bring together. So as the name of the lab suggests, it's, we are very interested in the operation of the brain and the nervous system, because it underpins the most fundamental, properties of us as living beings. But also it touches upon questions regarding, who we are, and what does it mean to be actually to have feelings, to have emotions, to have some subjective opinion about things, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, obviously, operation of the nervous system is important for our everyday functioning. If I want to bring a cup to my mouth, if I want to write a letter or type something, or walk or involve in any activities, it actually involves, all those operations involve, a very complicated processes happening throughout the nervous system and the body, and extending through the environment, so-called closing the loops via the environment. So we are trying to understand this both in healthy subjects, and also with a thought towards some applications to help people with some neurological disorders, and we use very different approaches to do so. So roughly speaking, in the brain embodiment laboratory, we are combining different levels of description, and we have correspondingly multidisciplinary projects. So the main strands of research are divided between there is some research on conceptual models, so trying to understand, put forward some models of operation of the elements of the nervous system. Then we also perform experimental work for brain-computer interfaces, which in our case are mostly using electroencephalogram. And there is other part of the laboratory where we perform also experiments with cultures of neurons. So we grow cultures of biological neurons in, if you like, in dishes, and we try to understand signals at that level as well. And we also use some simple robotic systems in our work, because on one side they enable us, for example, to close the loop around the say cultures. So that's what we call animats. These are robots controlled by the cultures of biological neurons grown in the dishes. But also robotic systems allow us to, if we integrate them, for example, with the brain-computer interfaces, then they allow us to look for solutions, for example, for, systems delivering stroke rehabilitation or stroke therapies.
I guess I want to slog through this more, the EEG recordings and basically the math of it before, I guess, getting to the fun part of cultured biological neurons controlling robots. So actually, a previous guest, Dr. Dominique Durand of Case Western, he was kind of suggesting that maybe these neuronal spikes and this activity may be only like one dimension of what we're seeing and one dimension of this information, I guess one like pipeline of information of what's going on in the brain. So how do we know that actually this is the majority of the information and that the actual information is not coming from somewhere else, but actually from these neuronal spikes?
Well, that's a very good question. In fact, we don't know that. It's widely assumed that effectively, if you like, based on neural doctrine, which originated quite a long while ago, that neurons are the main or the only cells in the nervous system that are actually involved in information processing, if you like. We also have other types of cells, glia cells, which were believed for quite a long time to be simply housekeepers, if you like. So they were supposed to be maintaining the homeostatic environment. So effectively, making sure that the conditions are right for the neurons to survive and to thrive. But otherwise, they were not thought to be very significantly involved in what neurons were doing as far as the information processing is concerned. However, actually, there is an increasing evidence that the situation is more complex than that, and that the different forms of glia cells might actually be involved in, at least in affecting what the neurons are doing. And in fact, they might be involved in information processing. So if you want, to a large extent, the question becomes then how much the information processing that actually supports, for example, our healthy operation, so be it, again, say, motor coordination or movement, how much of this is solely thanks to the neurons, or how much potentially glia cells are involved in generation of this information flow. Should we talk about neurons as being the powerhouse, horses of the information processing, or should we actually reconceptualize everything and think about maybe a neuroglia complex as the basic unit that supports information processing? So these are very interesting questions, which basically is a fascinating area to investigate. So we do also have one of the projects that actually look at the cell cultures is also looking at the glia cells. So we hope at this moment we are just characterizing the cell types and their heterogeneity, but we also hope to investigate how they might actually be involved in information processing.
And so with this cultured cell, you would be able to, I guess, tease out the variables and figure out how much each one is contributing, something like this?
So that's basically the basic idea. That's right. It's to a large extent, how much you can perform this. It also depends on, if you like, the resolution of your experimental gear and experimental kit. We are using multiple electrode arrays, which are, if you like, small dishes with an array of electrodes embedded in them, so that actually we obtain a sample of activity from the whole culture or from the whole network of cells. And that already allows you to look at the interactions across the cell. So that can be contrasted with the more traditional electrophysiological studies, in which typically you would use an electrode that you could record either intracortical signals or extracellular signals, and it would be very limited in terms of the actual reach. So if you're performing intracellular recordings, then obviously you're looking at the activity of just one cell. Extracellular recordings would allow you to look at a little bit wider, maybe at a cluster of cells nearby, but still doesn't give you. It gives you only a very limited information about interactions across the network, and the multi electrode arrays actually open up the possibility to look at this type of a mesoscale level dynamics.
Yeah, I've heard this kind of compared to having microphones in on a dinner party or something like this. And with the electrode arrays, you kind of have like 100 microphones in one corner of the room, which is, more useful than having just one. But I guess the question is like, maybe there's something else going on at the dinner party just beyond conversations, and maybe they're handing off food or dancing or something like this, which we wouldn't really pick up with microphones as well. But yeah, that's really interesting. I'm glad that you're making these experiments and going a step further with this.
So you're absolutely right. It's still the case that with the electrodes we are picking up the electrical activity of the cells, and that would be mostly the neural activity, because it is just a type of the experimental equipment that is it's tuned to receive this type of signals. But cells can communicate also in other ways. So you have, obviously, you have different chemicals being actually propagating through the medium, through the system. And the other side of this communication is the communication of the glial cells or astrocytes between themselves. They also form, if you like, a connected entity, and they talk to each other, so to speak. And this communication, in turn, may affect the neural signals. So yes, there are, if you like, communication channels that are not all picked up by the electrodes.
Okay, so now I'm very curious. I want to propose a theory that a friend of mine, actually, he's just a dilettante. He's kind of dabbles in science, but he was saying that neurons might be following like an 11-dimension conformal theory, that these networks, these conformal holes, actually make actually thoughts and patterns and everything like this. Did I explain this okay? Or I mean, would I have to send you his writings about this, or what do you think about it so far?
I seem to remember there was some news about this type of work. I need to look it up a bit more closely to actually to be able to place it in some context.
Okay, yeah, maybe I'll send you the links or the the writings and everything like this, because for me, my eyes glaze over when anything above calculus is mentioned, and I'm just like, please talk to somebody else. Okay, so maybe we can get to the fun part a little bit now and talk about these cultured cells. I'm very curious to hear about this. Actually, a previous guest, Dr. Meming Park, was doing something like this, and he was doing it for his PhD, I believe, and he was able to have a computer or a robot robot could be controlled by these cultured cells, and the cells, of course, the cultured neurons, and these neurons, of course, didn't know that they were part of a robot. They just kind of reacted to the inputs and everything like this. Is this more or less what you're doing?
Yes, in a nutshell, yes. That's the basic idea. But you actually, it's a very interesting turn of phrase that you use. The neurons do not know that they are part of the robot. Let me just turn it back on you. Do your neurons know that they are part of you? Neurons which are not, or the cells which are not actually at the a sensory surface, they are receiving only signals. And some of them are actually very much down the chain of the communication chain. So the neurons in your brain, particularly, they are several steps removed from the sensory surface. They don't see the world, so to speak. They don't smell the world. They don't hear the world. All they got is the communication that they are, communication bubble that they are a part of. So it's an interesting question how, whether you actually for the moment just, or for simplicity, just assume that all the communication, all the relevant bits are encoded in the electrical activity, in those spikes. It's an interesting question how this objective reality, those spike trains that neuron receives somewhere in the brain, how they are then translated in the fact that actually I can hear and understand our conversation as a subjective being. But in fact, even if you think there is more to the information processing than just the spike trains, if we think about some other forms of interactions, which definitely are present in the brain, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. How any sort of objective measurement, be it a chemical diffusion, for example, or electrical activity, how this actually translates into my own subjective perception and the subjective experience of the world. It's a much more generic and fundamental question with which both philosophers have been struggling for quite a long while, and I don't think that anybody at the moment actually is close to providing a solution that majority of the thinkers would agree upon.
I guess I apologize a little bit for this philosophical talk. Like, I'm in a conversation, a multi-day conversation with this friend, and we always talk philosophy. So this is why I guess I'm thinking about this. But let's describe your actual work with these cultured neurons and what have you done and what have been some of your achievements in this work?
Sure, but actually, I actually don't mind talking about philosophical questions. These are very, very close to me as well. So don't get me wrong. I think the type of the question, the type of the work that we are doing, it's almost this type of questions are hitting you straight in your face, because there are potentially very important and profound implications. And what you do with this type of system that we are looking at, also in order for this, even for practical reasons, if you want to effectively translate it into something useful, you make some assumptions about the implications of this work, in practical terms. So actually, I like this type of discussions as well. I'm just very much aware of the difficulties of actually going between, if you like, the philosophical argument on one side and the scientific argument on the other. But I think this type of dialogue has to happen. It's just that both sides have to appreciate the difficulties and try to talk a common language, so to speak.
Yeah, I would agree, because I guess by figuring out this philosophy, you can, I guess it defines your approach as well. So if you have maybe the wrong philosophy, then you would approach it from the wrong direction and maybe get wrong results as well. So this is maybe the most important thing is the philosophy. So that way we can get clear results and useful results as well.
Absolutely. So it is a matter of actually both, interpretation of the data, but also the way you pose the questions, how you frame your questions in the first place, also translates into how you set up your experiment. and then also how you set up the experiment combined with your kind of, if you like, philosophical stance, even if it's implicit, then forces a particular interpretation of the results you get. So yes, the combination of those factors will actually very much steer a particular research direction. So you can either continue along one path and basically, you will get the answers that maybe actually will be different if you actually assumed somewhat different philosophical framework.
Wow, you said it much better than I did. I have to admit. Okay, so maybe we can talk about this. Like, what were your philosophical, preconceptions, and then how did this evolve into your experiments as well?
Right. So basically, actually, the dominant view in neuroscience is, that depends. But obviously, the majority of neuroscience is still predominantly experimental. But there is also a quite sizable amount of computational work, and in fact, they are in broad agreement as far as the kind of the philosophical underpinnings are concerned, that effectively the neurons, because as we discussed earlier, they are supposed to do the bulk of the information processing, are doing just exactly that. That everything can be described in terms of information processing. And in fact, it's not just a description of reality, it's just what they do. However, there are also, by the way, this creates a little bit of a divide between what they do and what they are. So obviously, we know that neurons are biological cells, and therefore they have to be alive and perform all the biological functions that are necessary for their survival within the environment in which they live. But at the same time, there is this divorce between, on one side, the biological side of them, and also the information processing operations. These two are conceptually separated, at least as far as the computational approaches are concerned. Now, there are some movements in cognitive science that actually start to suggest that this conceptual division between operation and just biological makeup of the system is actually not accurate, and there is a lot of potential for at least shaping the information processing, just in lieu of the fact that they are biological beings. And in fact, some of the theories actually propose that in general, almost like the processing itself is probably not a good metaphor for describing. It's just that the cognitive side, if you like, and the biological are so intertwined that one is the flip side of the other. So effectively, it's one of the consequences is that rather than talking about the information processing, we should be talking about perhaps a mode of coupling or dynamical coupling between the cell and its environment, as effectively some of these couplings effectively result in something, in some operations that we can then subsequently, if so we wish, describe as information processing. Now, this is a description. That's not necessarily. I hope that I'm making clear a distinction. It might seem actually a minor distinction, but actually it may have quite profound consequences. I can describe many things in terms of information processing. It doesn't mean that at the very heart a particular process actually does the information processing. I'm just choosing to describe it that way.
Yeah, it's an approximation.
It is, if you like, it is an approximation. It's something that actually helps me to convey my understanding of the process to others. But it doesn't mean that the process itself is actually information processing, at its very core. So effectively, it's the views that are proposed as kind of a counterbalance this very computational abstract view are very much embedded in dynamical systems and the couplings between different parts of the systems between themselves and also between the system and its environment. So system here might be, for example, a cell. And therefore, you actually start to consider the cell as a whole without making necessarily distinctions between processes that are involved in what you would say maybe information processing and the other processes that maybe others traditionally would describe, oh, this is more to do with them being alive. So it becomes, if you like, one of the consequences of this is as well that actually forces you to start taking a little bit more approach from complex system science. So that's a movement in sciences that actually somehow went in slightly different direction than the majority of the science, which is based on a very reductive approach. You divide the object of your study into individual components. You try to isolate them, try to narrow down their operation and pinpoint in the experiments, and then understanding of the whole system comes from understanding of these individual parts. And that actually this approach in sciences has been very successful and brought a lot of advances, but reality is not always like that. Some of the fundamental properties of systems cannot be reduced to the operation of their constituent parts. Some of them are simply a result of the interaction between those parts. And therefore, if you think about it that way, you really are forced to at least to complement the reductive approach with this, a view of coming from complex system science.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic. We were joking about you before we started recording was that you're a Polish guy with a Japanese sounding last name. And so, but this may be, I guess, kind of ironic because this sounds like very Eastern style thinking, like holistic, bringing everything together versus the Western style atomistic type of thinking, which, as you said, is needed for science because there's no way you can look at the whole world and figure out the small parts and figure out how everything works. But I think we're in agreement that especially brain science is something that's just such a holistic thing that you can't chop it up into part by part and still really understand it because there's so many things at play that are such big factors as well. It's not like it's a tiny thing like, I don't know, the gravitation of Jupiter or something like this on our bodies. It's huge. It's like, I don't know, wind or something like this. I don't know how to describe it better. Wind on our bodies.
Well, so yes, there is definitely, we are not in a position that, let's say, physics might be, where you have a very clear separation of the scales and processes that happen at a particular scale. We can actually, at least, I'm making a huge approximation here, of course, but I'm not saying that physics has sorted out its description of reality, but it just advanced its conceptual framework much more than, for example, neuroscience. So there are different levels which are in physics which seem at least to be tied much more closely to a particular scale. For example, length scales and the time scales. So you can talk about the world of the molecules. When, for example, statistical physics might be the right description. And then you can move up the scales towards more coarse-grained worldview when we actually finally arrive at a at the macroscopic worlds of the Newtonian mechanics that we can see and perceive with our naked eye, and then you move on to larger scales where maybe the more macroscopic universe description are necessary. I think that in neuroscience we simply are not at that level. We don't know what those variables are, and if we just go by the usual scales, then we know that there are interactions that actually go across. So there is a lot of research going on showing importance of different neurotransmitters, which are chemicals, and some of them are specialized, used in very particular brain systems, and seem to be involved more in particular role. But at the same time, we are also interacting. So our nervous system is interacting with our body, and we are also interacting with the external world. We have also interactions with, in our society. So all of these interactions are happening across different scales, and effectively this composite effect may result in me actually reacting in a particular way in a particular situation, having a particular experience or subjective emotion. You cannot really reduce it to one level. It's say, oh, this is all simply to do with a particular social setting in which you are acting, or it is not only to do to this particular molecule or to this particular genetic makeup. It's all basically interplay of those different, if you like, closed loop embeddings that effectively define individuals. And yes, you're absolutely right that actually it is a more holistic view, and this type of analogies having been lost on some people working in enactive cognition, for example. So there are philosophers who actually try to investigate this type of parallels and see how perhaps Western philosophy was developed in quite different ways from Eastern philosophy, and in fact they try to bring some of the thinking from the Eastern philosophy into mainstream, cognitive science.
Interesting. This is really fascinating. I don't think I've had a conversation like this about like this on this podcast. And what it sounds like a little bit is that you're saying that neurobiology might have more to do with sociology, where humans and people are influenced by their friends, their family, their government, and all these different levels and their individual choices that they make.
Well, I would say you probably can learn about human when you look at humans from different perspectives and different scales and different dimensions. So obviously one dimension, one plane of description is neurobiological. So you still, this is a very important to look at the individual receptors and ion channels and the structures in the brain and how they interact. And this gives us a wealth of information about, our healthy function and our disease. But at the same time, we are not completely predetermined only by those factors. So there are a lot of factors that simply affect how this biological system is working, which are outside of it. And the overall dynamics, so to speak, of the system, which is me or you or anybody else, is a kind of a sum total of this type of interaction. Some of them are at the microscopic level, which might be described by looking at your typical neuroscience experiments, and some of them are a result of these more kind of embeddings, social embeddings, if you like.
So how do you, I guess, model these kind of higher dimensional and multi-causal kind of factors? I mean, it sounds extremely complicated. Like, obviously, every time you bring in another factor, it's becomes that much more difficult. It becomes orders of magnitude more difficult to solve. So do you think there is some, computational ways to solve this, or maybe AI or something like this might be able to hold the key to this? Or what do you think the future is to be able to fully understand everything and take all these variables into account?
Well, I think that the key is with difficulty indeed. It's one of the reasons or criticisms towards this type of approach is coming from the reductionist science is exactly the explosion of the computational complexity, and at the same time, the system becomes that if you try to include everything, then effectively no amount of data that you get is enough to constrain all sorts of parameters, all sorts of models. So actually, you are always approximating anyway. At this moment, I don't think we are anywhere close to actually to create complete models that would go really across all the scales. So it's just a matter of I suppose, of perspective and simply understanding the consequences of your assumptions. Now, what kind of models? So all that you mentioned, will be important. So obviously, computational power will be important to include more and more assumptions about your models. But I suppose also asking even this type of questions, framing them appropriately, at least enables you to start considering what are the dominant variables that affect system operating in particular conditions. Is our reductive assumption actually a good assumption? Or by framing the questions in a reductive way, by creating an experiment in a way that actually this is a right approach, are we answering how the system would behave in the wild? Or are we just simply answering the questions about how the system behaves in this very constrained condition in the laboratory? So I think it's simply being aware of the limitations that may help us to maybe rephrase some questions and start actually considering what are the variables that actually might be playing a role in a particular phenomenon. It is, going to be difficult. It's very multidisciplinary, and as I said before, we are basically on a path rather than I don't see that we are going to ever create if you like a full model. It's always going to be some form of an approximation.
Yeah, I believe it. I mean, I think the model is probably very impossible, possibly for the human brain to understand. Like I said, it could be 11 dimensions, and we have no way of really wrapping our minds around that. But what would be some tips, do you think, that you could give to the listeners that in order that they are, I don't know, more aware of all their assumptions and what they're going into, and maybe not be so reductionist? I mean, it sounded like it was kind of a bad thing to be a reductionist.
No, I wouldn't like to say that it's bad. As I said earlier, and I need to emphasize this more, I think, there is a lot of excellent science that is done within the reductionist framework. And look, actually, majority of what we've got so far as the understanding of the brain, the nervous system, advances in terms of the pharmacological treatments for all sorts of diseases, that's most of it is based on actually reductive approach. So we've made a tremendous advances in sciences just by doing that. All I'm saying is that there are perhaps some limitations. Certain questions may not be answered just by continuing using this particular framework, and it's a matter of matching questions to your philosophical assumptions, I guess.
So, do you have any practical tips for how to, I guess, make it a little bit more ideal, make it a little bit more all-encompassing?
It's I guess the question is of indeed what is the question, what is the aim of a particular research, and some of those are so relatively narrowly and precisely focused, such that actually a reductionist approach might be quite appropriate. But questions that starts to, personally, that's my feeling, that the questions that starts to impinge on almost kind of a fundamental properties of who we are, when you start to try to divide this, bridge this divide between, on an objective description of the reality in terms of my own constituents, biological, molecular, and so on and so forth, on one hand, and on the other hand, trying to relate them to my subjective perception of the reality. That's where I think that's one of the areas where potentially reductionist approach might be somewhat limited. Are these of importance? Well, one could say these are not important, or perhaps these are somewhat philosophical. But there are conditions that we know as well of our own well-being that actually are quite crucially related to our own subjective perception of the world. We have emotional states and emotional disorders, and that's where I feel, almost by definition, we refer to those states invoking our subjective experiences. And these they will definitely have some underlying biological objective reality that will contribute to them. But there will be also probably some elements that are involved that also are shaped in a different way.
Okay, well, I'm gonna have to chew on this a little bit and maybe listen to it a few more times to fully understand everything. Yeah. So, do you have any recommendations on who we should talk to or what we should read?
So there is a lot of quite interesting work on enactive cognition that actually starts from it's an area that on one side tried to redefine the cognitive science, but also it's partly cognitive, partly philosophical, very foundational, that tries to actually bridge this gap between the objective description of the reality and the subjective description of the reality. So Evan Thompson is, for example, one of the people that have been making some advances. This is building on the work of late Francesco Varela, and who himself collaborated with Humberto Maturana. So Evan Thompson is one of them, but there are other people that have been doing a lot of interesting work there. So there are certain pockets of, if you like, within the sciences that try to approach this from somewhat different perspectives, but also sharing some level of similarities. So enactive cognition is one, as I said, Evan Thompson, but there is also very interesting work from Mark Bighart, more on the philosophical side. And Terence Deacon has been also writing quite interesting stuff on this matter.
Okay, yeah. So many listeners are just starting out in this field. What are your recommendations for how to get into this field?
Well, I guess you probably want to pick up some of the texts that maybe actually give you some overview of the field. Depends really where your interests are. I guess it's probably easier to look at some introductory texts on complex science or complex systems. They may not necessarily be about applicable directly to or describing directly our nervous system, but at least gives you some form of a framework. What does it mean? How does it differ from, let's say, more reductionist approaches? And what kind of phenomena we can observe. And then you have maybe some texts in somewhere at the border between cognitive science and philosophy of mind, where actually you might be able to see how this type of framework might work in this particular context. So as I said already, Evan Thompson is one of the authors. Alva Noe is another. I know that they've written some of the text for more kind of, if you like, a wider audience. So does Terence Deacon. So all those authors have their books, which in principle you can get them in the bookstores, general bookstores. They are not necessarily all very easy reading, but I think it's a possible starting point.
I'm going to check out all that stuff because that's something I haven't heard before. So that's very informative. I'm going to definitely look into this. Dr. Slawomir Nasuto, thank you so much. This has been excellent. Is there anything else that you want to cover? I mean, we didn't really get into the details of your research so much, but nonetheless, I think this was very, very useful and, as I said, unique so far in the history of this podcast. So yeah, but do you have anything else that you want to cover?
So yes, maybe just in few sentences, because indeed we've kind of diverged towards more foundational and if you like philosophical musings, but indeed we actually do a lot of quite concrete work. So we built brain-computer interfaces. So one of the systems that we created is actually using music. Effectively, we are trying to assess from electroencephalogram, effectively from electrodes picking up on the electrical activity generated by the brain, whether we can learn from this type of signals what is the emotional state of the subject, and using this information and this analysis of the data, we are trying to then modify synthetically generated music such that actually this music is then heard by the subject and hopefully helping the subject to move emotionally in a positive direction. So it actually also illustrates a couple of important points. This subjective interplay between the subjective state on one hand, because at the end of the day, you know that you feel happy or sad or nostalgic. So that's definitely a subjective side, but we also try to understand objectively what are the objective correlates of that subjective state. And we try to affect it by closing this loop via the playing of the music and modifying the music in our brain-computer interface system. So it touches upon a couple of things that we discussed earlier, but at the same time, it's a technological development that itself might have very useful applications. For example, for people suffering from some emotional disorders, and that's something that we would like very much to pursue in our research. We also use this concept of brain-computer interfaces, and we try to, with colleagues here at Reading, we try to build systems that could be used for example, for rehabilitation or aid rehabilitation of people suffering from stroke. So typically people in stroke might be affected. For example, their movement may be impaired. And it is important to provide them with some form of therapy that hopefully will restore at least some of the functionality. So in our work, we try to combine brain-computer interfaces, virtual reality, and assistive robotics to create integrated systems that actually can, again, provide assistance and therapy to the patients in order to help them to regain some functionality. So that's if you like on the dry side, so using the EEG signals. But on the wet side, so with the cultures, actually the work that we do here is also has potential applications. We want to understand by looking at how the cells are interconnecting, how they interact in the dishes with these multiple electrode arrays. When we put them in a closed loop with a robotic device. We want to understand how these interactions perhaps change over time and how we could use this type of technology in order to understand better, how can we help people with affected by stroke. So one potential line which we really are keen on investigating is to understand better the stem cell therapies. You know that basically there have been several attempts around the world to actually use stem cells in order to help stroke victims by perhaps inserting stem cells into the affected area in the brain, and sometimes they actually seem to show some remarkable improvements. Sometimes this is not the case, and the reason why there is this variability is in the outcomes is because I don't think we understand quite well what is the mechanism by which this type of therapy might actually help. And now in systems like ours, in the Animat, actually we can potentially perform this type of analysis. We can simulate this situation and actually investigate what are the factors that help the improvement, because then actually we can try to optimize the therapy for a given patient.
Yeah, it sounds like your big research. I guess the overarching theme of all this research is closing the feedback loop. So shortening the feedback loop of what you're doing and then getting the results from this. So with the music, with this stem cell therapy, it's all about speeding up the results, something like this. But Dr. Nasuto, this has been great. Thank you so much. I want to be respectful of your time. How do people contact you? How do people get in touch if they like what they've heard so far?
So, we have a web page, so Brain Embodiment Laboratory web page, and obviously I'm also, our information is on the School of Biological Sciences at Reading www pages. I'm available online, so to speak. And you are absolutely right. So thank you very much. Actually, you're spot on that actually one of the fundamental things that is a common theme is this closing of the loop. And also actually it is quite important that this is happening. Actually, we are looking at this at different levels. So with the cells grown in the cultures, you remember I was talking about the length scales. So this is basically happening at the mesoscale level. On the other hand, with the brain-computer interface, we are looking at the macroscale level. It's a global, right? Because it actually involves the whole brain and the nervous system and the interactions through the environment. But nevertheless, it was exactly spot on observation. So I think I've done at least, if it is a difficult topic, but at least I feel I've done actually at least some explanation, right? Because you picked up on this perfectly.
Well, thank you. Thank you for basically calling me observant. Okay, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
Okay, guys, hopefully that wasn't too philosophical for you. Hopefully you were able to learn something from it. See, I personally really enjoyed it. I wouldn't mind if we had more of these kinds of interviews, or I don't know, like that was the thing is Dr. Nasuto, once we got on this, I guess, path, once we got on these like deep conversations, he didn't really want to go off of it. I tried to steer him off a little bit and be like, okay, so actually, how was your research and what have you done in your lab? But I think he seemed to really enjoy it, and I really enjoyed it as well. So it seems like they're really. It would be very difficult to have a podcast with both of these factors, and to have, I guess, a normal length podcast with both of these factors as well. So I'm wondering what to do. I guess please write to me. Please write to me on LinkedIn and let me know what you're thinking. If you've enjoyed this, if you found it useful, if I should keep doing these kinds of podcasts, if I should keep doing these kinds of episodes, or not, or if I should stay with more of the, I don't know, the nuts and bolts of things and what people are doing. So please let me know, because I am getting, there is a good amount of downloads, but I'm not getting nearly as much feedback. So maybe like 1% of the listeners write in. So what I'm saying is basically by writing in, you can have 100 times the voice of what you would expect. So you as one listener can have 100 times the control or the direction that this podcast goes. And it can be helpful. Hopefully you're a good person and want this podcast to go in a good direction. So you can have a big control just by writing me. And it's very, very simple, very easily. Just on LinkedIn, which is where I'm assuming actually most of you are listening from, or where you're finding out about this. Just write to me there and let me know what you think. So hopefully you enjoyed this, and we'll talk again next week.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.